Hi everybody. So today we're going to talk about the immune system. This is kind of our last piece of the puzzle. I just want to give you a little bit of information so we can better understand what's happening when we talk about the coronavirus or COVID-19 and how our immune response responds to these various things. Okay, so the first thing I want you to know is what a pathogen is. A pathogen is basically anything that causes a disease. So we're going to talk about viruses and bacteria, but it can be a fungal disease. So if you've ever had athlete's foot, that's an example. Some protists can cause diseases like malaria. But probably the two most common things you'll run into are viruses and bacteria. So here's my slide with viruses. This should all be familiar. You should know what an enveloped virus is, right? We know, so that means it has that membrane. We know the genetic material can be either DNA or RNA. We know that it has surface proteins that are how it gets into our cells. And here are some examples of diseases that are caused by viruses. So influenza, that's the flu, the seasonal flu virus is an example. And some of these you may recognize because you've been vaccinated against them. So measles, mumps, you guys all got chickenpox vaccines. I actually got the chickenpox when I was little. So these things should be somewhat familiar. All right. And then in addition to viruses, we know that bacteria can also cause diseases. So remember, bacteria are cells. So these are much bigger than viruses. And they have all of those characteristics of living things that we talked about earlier, but they're pretty simple cells. So remember, these are prokaryotic cells. So they just have DNA, a cytoplasm with all the various things they need, and then they're surrounded by a cell membrane and a cell wall. And here are some examples of diseases that are caused by bacteria. So you may have had strep throat, and so you're given an antibiotic because antibiotics help kill bacteria. Again, some of these you may have also gotten vaccinated from. So tetanus and diphtheria are common vaccinations. All right. The other thing we need to think about is how do pathogens actually get into our system, right? They have to find a way in to infect our cells. So these are the common ways. So exposure to body fluids, inhalation or ingestion, and it gives some examples of each of those types. And then there's this fourth way, which is transmission through an intermediate host. So we refer to this as a vector-borne disease. So the vector is usually a mosquito or a fly, usually some sort of insect, though it can be other things. And what happens is, so let's say in the case of Lyme disease, all right, the tick will feed off of a deer that has Lyme disease, and then it just so happens that tick lands on you, and it transfers the bacteria then into your system, okay? So these are examples: Lyme disease, West Nile, malaria, bubonic plague, for those of you that like history. So these are vector-borne. If you take environmental science, we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail. Okay, so how does our immune system now react? So we know some things get through our initial defenses, but there's two lines of defense that we use. So the first are non-specific. So it's basically targeting anything. It's kind of saying we're going to put these barriers up and prevent anything from getting in. And then if things get past these, we have specific defenses, and that would be directed against that particular pathogen only. So in the case of coronavirus, you're going to mount a response that specifically targets that virus and no other ones. So this takes a little bit longer to sort of get going. So that's why sometimes there's a lag, and it takes us a little bit to fight these things off. All right, one of the great things about our immune system is we develop what's called immune memory. And that means if we see those invaders again, we usually can mount a response so quickly that we actually wind up resistant to that particular disease or pathogen. All right, and just a vocabulary word we're going to come back to, but that's antigen. An antigen is a specific foreign substance, right? It's basically anything that our immune system reacts to. So your immune system is reacting to an antigen. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's start talking about the non-specific defenses. So this is basically either block it from entering or get it like right as it's starting to get in, like before it actually does too much damage. So epithelium, that's just a fancy word for like a covering of a body area. So skin is an example of an epithelium. So your skin acts as a barrier, prevents things from getting in. Our saliva and our tears, for example, have enzymes like lysozyme, which actually helps break down bacterial cell walls. So again, it's non-specific, but you might catch some things here. When we talked about the respiratory system, we talked about protection by mucus. So the idea was that invaders or pathogens could be caught in the mucus and then we can get them out right away. Some pathogens that you might ingest, actually our stomach acid, which is low in pH, helps to get rid of a lot of those. And then that first line of defense also includes immune cells that actually ingest the pathogens. So we call these phagocytes. So you may remember when we talked about phagocytosis, which is basically like the cell membrane would just kind of ooze around something and ingest it. So that's what's happening with these generalized cells. All right, and when this is going on, these first non-specific defenses, you might have a localized response. So it's just something that's right in that area. If you've ever gotten like a splinter in your hand, you'll notice it gets a little red. It might get a little hot to the touch. And that's because these first immune cells are releasing chemicals that increase the blood supply. And so it gets a little red and a little hotter than normal. Okay, so those are the non-specific defenses. And here's our cartoon. So here's our pathogens. So a lot of them can't even make it through the barrier of the skin and mucous membranes. Those that make it through are going to hit the second line of defense, which is phagocytosis by macrophages. So macro means big. Phage means eating. So these are the big eaters. So they eat big things like bacteria, for instance. Okay, so this is the second line. These first and second line is all non-specific. But some things may make it past even that. And so this is when the third line of defense or the specific immune response kicks in. And the cells we're going to talk about here are the lymphocytes. Okay, so the specific defenses of the immune system. These are, again, directed towards specific foreign substances and pathogens. All right, this is the white blood cells or the lymphocytes. And there are two branches to this response. There's antibody-mediated, or sometimes it's referred to as the humoral response. And this is for things that are in the blood, like bacteria that might be in the blood or various parts of the body, but they don't get into cells. All right, the second arm is the cell-mediated, and this is for things like viruses that we've already talked about that actually invade the cells. So we need to actually recognize which cells have been invaded and get rid of those. All right, so those are the two branches, and there's two different lymphocytes. So the antibody-mediated, we're going to talk about B lymphocytes, or we shorten it to B cells, and the cell-mediated version is T lymphocytes, or T cells. Okay, and I thought I'd just briefly put this up here. If you take anatomy and physiology, you'll learn more, but you may have heard of things like lymph nodes or thymus and spleen, and these are just areas in the body where you have larger accumulations of white blood cells. Okay, so let's start talking about antibody-mediated immunity. So remember, these are the B cells, all right, and this is, we're going to talk about antibodies. So let's think back. Do you remember what I said an antigen was? So an antigen is anything that causes your immune system to react. All right, and one of the ways the immune system reacts is by making antibodies that recognize that particular antigen and that particular antigen only. All right, and we sometimes visualize these as like Y-shaped receptors. So these are proteins that bind to this particular type of antigen. All right, and they can either be in the membrane or they can just be proteins that are loose in the bloodstream. All right, and as I said, these are very specific. So you actually have millions of different B cells, and you're just relying on one of those B cells being able to recognize whatever particular antigen it is. Okay? Once this antibody binds the antigen, you have two main responses, right? The cell starts dividing and it makes plasma cells, and their only function is to churn out more of these antibodies. So we get lots of antibodies that can recognize this antigen. The second thing is it makes some memory cells. And we'll come back in a little bit to what those memory cells do. All right, so here's our cartoon. Here's our B lymphocytes. And you see these little Ys that are in the cell membrane. Those are the antibodies. So in this case, these antibodies are recognizing an antigen. And the antigen here is visualized by these triangles. So there's some protein in this bacterial cell wall that this antibody recognizes. So it binds to it. Okay? And once that happens, so here's our B cell binding to our bacteria, we said it does two things. It starts making plasma cells. So their only job is to churn out tons of antibodies, and they release them in the bloodstream. So these antibodies then can travel throughout the body, and anywhere they encounter this particular bacteria, they can bind to it. All right, and they can cause these to clump together, and they can also activate other parts of the immune system. But the overall effect is it gets rid of these bacteria. Okay, the other thing that happens is it makes memory cells. And these are cells that are going to have this particular antibody, and they're going to be there in case we ever encounter this bacteria again. All right, so that's our humoral immunity. And here's how the antibodies work. So I already mentioned this. So they can make things clump together. We call that agglutination is the fancy word. It can trigger other components. And one of those components is called the complement system. Again, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here, but you'll hear about it more if you ever take anatomy and physiology. All right, here is our cell-mediated immune response. So its job is to detect and destroy viruses that are inside of cells. So remember, viruses invade. So they're not always like floating in the bloodstream. They're actually in our cells. So we need some way to recognize that this cell is now different. So remember, when this virus invades, it makes this cell churn out viral proteins. And some of those viral proteins wind up in the cell membrane. And that's what these T cells, and now we have T cell receptors, are binding to. So they're going to recognize cells that are basically weird. They're weird cells because they have viral proteins now. All right. And again, you have a couple different things happening. You have memory cells, similar to the B cells. And now we make cytotoxic T cells. These basically are T cells that then destroy the cell. Okay. So they get rid of the virus and they get rid of our cell along with it. All right. And then it also makes something called helper T cells. And these just help sort of rev up the immune response. All right, and so we talked about those memory cells. So look what's happening. The first time you get an infection, right, it takes a while, 7 days, you're still kind of ramping up, and it doesn't get all the way up. So we might be sick for a little while. But if you see this antigen again years later, look how quickly the immune system responds, because those memory cells are there, and it responds so quickly and with so much that you probably won't even get sick the second time around. So that gives you some immunity from the disease. All right, and then I thought I'd end with just a few examples of either when the immune system goes wrong or just some interesting things. So you may have heard of an autoimmune disorder. So this is when the immune system, instead of attacking pathogens, actually attacks itself. So it makes a mistake. An example of this is rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis. There's actually a bunch of autoimmune disorders. I have allergies, I know, especially this time of year. And this is basically kind of the similar thing. Your immune system is reacting to some allergen that really isn't going to cause a problem, but it overreacts to it. And it can either cause just like hay fever, or it can be pretty life-threatening and sort of trigger asthma symptoms. All right. And one of the things that happens is it triggers the release of histamine, and that's why we take antihistamines. All right, and the last thing is AIDS, and I think we talked about this, how the problem with AIDS is it attacks the T cells, so then it limits the immune response. Okay, I think that's it. Have a great day.